The stems left a wet crescent on Daniel's wrist where the florist had wrapped the bouquet too tightly. Chrysanthemums and two overconfident roses, slightly bruised, like most good intentions after a subway ride. Outside the glass facade of the Hawthorne School, Manhattan was a high-gloss brochure, polished marble, a security desk with a bowl of individually wrapped mints, hallways that smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and ambition. Daniel wiped his hands on his jeans and smoothed his thrift store jacket, the one Clara said made him look like a Brooklyn architect. He was an audio designer who edited wedding videos for money and scored micro-budget films for hope. Today, he'd deliver a different kind of soundtrack. Surprised laughter, a relieved exhale, the soft rustle of tickets to a borrowed weekend upstate. He rehearsed the line in his head. Your husband kidnaps you for 48 hours. Consent forms have been emailed. Clara would roll her eyes and kiss him with the careful urgency they'd learned during long weeks of misaligned schedules. He pictured her office with the slanted sunlight across diplomas, the bulletin board crowded with pastel sticky notes. Remember to drink water. For the kids and for herself. The security guard asked for ID, and Daniel slid his driver's license under the glass. The guard typed something, frowned, and called someone. Mr. Brooks, HR just wants to print a badge. He said it like a gift. Daniel waited, watching students pass in the reflection. Blazers, phones in palms like talismans. Somewhere a bell chimed with the softness of money. His phone throbbed in his pocket, a Slack ping from a client about a cut that wasn't smoothing right between vows and toast. He muted it. Today he was a husband with a bouquet and 2 train tickets bought with points. A woman from HR arrived, efficient in navy and white, a lanyard clipped like a verdict. Come with me, Mr. Brooks, she said, voice dipped in officious courtesy. Up 2 floors, glass conference rooms, a wall of framed mission statements. She logged into a workstation the size of a kitchen table. We like to keep our visitor records accurate, she said, fingers fluttering over the keys. Spouses get additional access. What's your spouse's name? Clara Hale, Daniel said, putting the flowers on the table. She's a counselor. Brown hair, red scarf, always reminding people to breathe. The woman smiled without teeth. Yes, Clara, wonderful. We'll just add you. A window bloomed on the screen, a nested list of permissions like a city map. Daniel saw Clara's name, her staff ID, a row labeled Dependents and Benefits. The woman's smile thinned. Her fingers stopped. What? Daniel asked, too gently. He'd leaned in out of habit, like leaning toward a waveform to hear the error. It seems Clara already has a spouse on file. The woman rotated the screen a fraction. A courtesy, a cruelty. The words were neat and banal. Spouse, Elijah Mercer. The E sat there like a turned key. Daniel's first impulse was clerical. A mistake, a misclick, a ghost in the administrator. E could be employee, external, exception. His mouth collected air and then released it with nothing attached. That's not... He heard himself from far away. We're married. The woman nodded the way people nod to strangers who might cry. These systems reflect legal documents. I'm afraid I can't change it without Ms. Hale present and proper paperwork. We'll issue a standard visitor badge for today. She printed something. The printer hummed. The bouquet tilted. Down the hall, student laughter ricocheted and died. Daniel thought of their courthouse photos. Clara in a simple dress. Daniel in the same jacket. Both looking stunned and privately elated. A clerk with a dry cough. A ring that cost less than their monthly Metro cards. He thought of the vows they'd written in the kitchen. Words about choosing someone every day, even when every day looked like overdue invoices. Would you like to wait in her office? The woman said. He nodded, hand closing around the bouquet as if it could keep him upright. The petals were damp and cold. Clara's office had a diffuser releasing lavender into the future. A bookshelf of adolescent fiction and clinical manuals, trauma and the body, the teenage brain, crafting safety plans, Polaroids of advisory groups, a watercolor of a lake that wasn't theirs, a mug with Be Kind, Rewind. Daniel had found it at a thrift store and convinced himself it was a love song to his obsolete skills. He sat. He tried to listen for something ordinary, the HVAC's even breath, the city murmur. When Clara entered, her smile was a reflex that took one step and then froze. "You," she said, soft and delighted, before the room told her its new shape. The visitor badge on his chest, the stillness. "I brought flowers," Daniel said, standing like a giraffe on a boat. "HR says you're married to an E." Clara put her bag down and leaned against the door as if it needed holding. She didn't touch the flowers. "Daniel," she said, and then nothing. And then, "Okay." She looked at the glass wall, the hallway where students could pass like weather. "Close the blinds?" The slats whispered down. New York thin to gray stripes. Clara sat across from him, knees almost touching. "I should have fixed it years ago," she said. "Before you. Before this." "Fixed what?" He kept his voice low, but somewhere inside it, something had snapped and was now humming with a frequency no one else could hear. "On paper, I'm still married," she said, "to someone I met in grad school. Elijah. It started as survival. Rent, health insurance. We were two people in a city that priced us out of dignity." She held up a hand, not to stop him, but to keep the sentence from falling apart. "We broke up. We moved. We promised to file. We didn't. I told myself it was a postcard I forgot to send." Daniel almost laughed. Not at her, but at the domesticity of the metaphor, the way it made bureaucracy sound quaint. "You married me," he said. "We filed our license." "We did," she said. "New York accepted it because they didn't see the California record. States don't always talk to each other unless you give them a reason. I gave no reasons. I thought I would fix it quietly. And then work happened. And then us. And then HR happened," he said, tasting the bitterness on the back of his mouth. She nodded, eyes bright with something that wasn't exactly tears. "I didn't intend to hurt you. I was going to tell you, and each day that I didn't become a wall I didn't know how to climb. Elijah reached out last week about a joint account we opened for bills back then. He needs my signature to close it. I didn't reply." The bouquet perfumed the silence like an apology made of stems. Daniel looked at Clara's hands, unpolished nails, a thin scar by the knuckle from a college kitchen shift. He loved those hands for their ordinary bravery, the way they had learned a map of his face in the dark of budget apartments. He also hated, in that moment, the story they told him, that his wife contained a city he did not have a visa for. "What do you want me to do with this?" he asked, lifting the bouquet a quarter inch. It was an absurd question with an honest center. "Put it in water," Clara said, voice steadying. "Sit with me. Yell later if you need to, but sit now." He found a vase in the cabinet, the kind of institutional glass that remembered other flowers. Water gurgled into it like a small storm. He cut the stems, the motions practical and tidy, like setting a broken bone before asking who pushed. Behind the blinds, the city continued its commerce of minutes. Slack messages waited to be answered. A student would knock soon, perhaps, with a panic she could tend to. The world insisted on happening even when a single word in a single database had cleaved a life in two. "Spouse," Daniel said, testing the weight of it. "We'll need a lawyer." "We will," Clara said. "And I will call Elijah, and I will call the county clerk, and I will tell you everything I should have said in the order I should have said it." He set the vase between them on the low table, the flowers suddenly formal. He wished for a simpler cruelty, an affair he could hunt, a villain he could name. Instead, he had the slow drama of paperwork and the ache of a love that had arrived late to a party still going from years ago. "Okay," he said, and the word was both surrender and a line drawn with a careful hand. "Start at the beginning." Clara took a breath that seemed to bring the room into focus. "It begins with a flu," she said, "and a bill." Outside, a bell chimed again, indifferent and exact. The beginning was a cough. Not a storybook cough, no lace handkerchief and tragic foreshadowing. Just the blunt, animal bark of a body overworked and uninsured. In Clara's memory, the sound lives in a small Oakland apartment in 2016. A mattress on the floor, a window that didn't close all the way, the taste of dust that came like weather under the door. On the fridge, a magnet held up a post-it that read, "Don't get sick," underlined twice, as if emphasis could be a vaccine. Daniel listened as Clara placed the years between them like file folders. The blinds in her office cast gray ladders on their knees. He could smell the lavender and the chlorinated whisper of fresh-cut stems. "It was January," Clara said. "The radiator was auditioning for percussion, the rain was a joke, and grad school felt like paying to prove you deserve to help people for free." He could see the version of her then. Thrifted cardigan, hair in an impatient knot, a tote bag bruised by textbooks. He had not known her yet. His life, in that year, had been different rain, different bills. The omniscient narrator in him, some voice he didn't own, understood that parallel timelines were only romantic until they collided and found the mess. Elijah arrived in her story like a chord strummed on a borrowed guitar. "He lived down the hall," Clara said. "He'd leave soup on my step when I was studying late. He worked nights at a bar on Telegraph, played shows where the amp was always half broken." Daniel flinched inwardly at the warmth in her voice, then noticed it wasn't love so much as tenderness for a shared poverty. There is a way people talk about their 20s, he thought, like a rural town they escaped and sometimes miss at dusk. "The cough became a fever," Clara went on. "I told myself it was a cold. I drank tea. I went to campus anyway. Then one night I couldn't breathe right. Elijah drove me to the ER in his Corolla with a coat hanger for an antenna. They gave me albuterol and a bill that could have bought a used car without the coat hanger." In the story, Elijah sat in the hard chair with the broken vinyl and texted his bar manager. In the story, a nurse with a shark tattoo on her wrist said, "Insurance?" And Clara had looked at the nurse the way people look at sunsets they can't afford. Hungry, a little ashamed. "After," Clara said, "we sat in the cafeteria with the fluorescent lights that made everyone honest. Elijah told me he'd married a friend once, for benefits. They'd gotten divorced when she found a real job with good coverage. He said sometimes paperwork was a way to keep breathing." Daniel watched her hands braid and unbraid themselves in her lap. Somewhere in the building, a student laughed, a high, bright sound that felt obscene against the quiet they were building. "How long did you know him before?" Daniel asked, careful, as if language were glassware. 6 months, she said. "We were friends. We were sometimes more, sometimes not. We said vows at City Hall with 2 strangers as witnesses. We ate tacos after and laughed because the officiant mispronounced my last name. We were young, and we thought improvisation was maturity." She paused. "He put me on his union plan. We split rent evenly for the first time. We were less afraid of the mail. It felt like the opposite of romance, and also, somehow, like a kind of devotion. 2 people conspiring not to drown." Daniel remembered the Hawthorne School's mission statement framed in sepia down the hall, building resilience in a complex world. He wondered how many sanctioned ways there were to spell resilience before it became a performance. Clara opened the bottom drawer of her desk and withdrew a thin folder, the kind meant for lesson plans and permission slips. She slid it across the table. Inside, copies of a marriage certificate from Alameda County, a lease agreement, a printout of an old email chain titled Re-Anthem Plan Options, and a photo taken at dusk in front of a mural of red poppies. In the picture, Elijah had a grin with one chipped tooth and eyes that tried too hard. Clara looked like a person trying not to flinch at a camera flash. "He was kind," she said. "He was messy. He was a good listener, until he wasn't. We lived like roommates with a secret chore chart. And then I got an internship in San Diego for a summer, and he got a gig driving a van for a band through Oregon, and we started talking like people who live in different climates. When I moved to New York for the counseling job, I told myself I would start the divorce paperwork once I found an apartment and a dentist and a grocery store I could walk to without crying." "And then life," Daniel said, not unkindly. "And then life," Clara echoed. "I told him I'd file. He said he would. We sent each other checklists. Somewhere a form needed a signature that went unsent. Somewhere a packet came while I was between sublets and disappeared into a mailroom shaped like a black hole." On Daniel's phone, in his pocket, a calendar alert chimed. Amtrak reminder for a departure that would now be a metaphor. He silenced it. The silence seemed heavier after being briefly interrupted. "Last week," Clara said, "Elijah wrote to say the joint account, the one we used for bills, has a $37 balance and an overdraft fee pending. He wants to close it and needed my signature. He attached the form. I opened the email 3 times and closed it 4. "You could have told me," Daniel said. Not an accusation. A weather report. "I should have," she said. "I kept thinking, tomorrow, when I'm less tired, after this parent conference, when grades are in, but time is a trickster that sells you tomorrow wholesale and then delivers in backorder." Across the city, Elijah was folding bar towels that smelled like limes and bleach, telling a coworker he needed to get clean about the ghost marriage. He would, later, search his inbox for Clara's name and stare at the yawning inbox like a stage with no audience. He kept a stack of unopened envelopes in a ceramic bowl by his keys, promising himself a Sunday he would dedicate to grown-up things. "Do you still care for him?" Daniel asked. The question a pebble dropped in a deep well where he braced for no splash. Clara's answer took a moment to decide what kind of truth it wanted to be. "I care about that winter," she said. "About the version of me who believed emergencies made a person unworthy. I care about the person who gave me soup and then documents. But love, the kind that builds and pays taxes and buys light bulbs, no. I chose you. And then I failed to choose you with all the paperwork that choice deserved." The word failed set something tender in Daniel. A wire strummed. He remembered their kitchen last fall, Clara pinning a newspaper recipe for roasted carrots, her handwriting everywhere in the margins, less cumin, add lemon, editing the world into something they could eat. He had loved her editorial hope. He had not accounted for the drafts she'd kept from him. He lifted the photo from the folder. The poppies behind young Clara were painted to look like they were moving in a wind that a mural could not actually feel. Elijah's hand hovered a centimeter from her shoulder, as if the artist had forbidden touching. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "To be angry, without abandoning me," she said. "To walk with me to a lawyer. To not romanticize or demonize the past, mine or yours. To ask me questions even when the answers are boring and bureaucratic. To eat dinner tonight." He almost laughed. The list was such a Clara list. Moral, practical, tender. "Dinner," he repeated, as if the word were a clean promise. Her office phone pinged with a calendar notification for an afternoon intake. Sophomore, anxiety spike after a group project imploded over Discord. The screen's glow painted a small circle on the desk like a stage light. You have students, Daniel said. I do, Clara said. And you have a client asking why the vows sound tinny. She pointed at his pocket with a knowing look. They sat for a moment longer, two adults inside a square of quiet, trying to agree on the shape of the world again. The bouquet in the vase had begun, in the filtered light, to seem less like an apology and more like a witness. Stems cut to fit, petals doing their small labor of opening in a place that wasn't exactly theirs. After work, Clara said, we'll go to legal aid and then to the bodega with the good grapes. We'll write emails to counties and attach PDFs that never want to be attached. We'll make a list. And we'll call Elijah, Daniel said, surprising himself with the inclusion. I want to hear him say the word close about that account. I want receipts. Clara reached across the table, then palm up. He placed his hand in hers, not as a truce, but as a bridge that might hold for as long as it needed to. Outside the blinds, the city practiced its lessons. Keep going, keep paying, keep your head down in the wind. Somewhere, a train carried strangers to dinners and arguments and microwaves humming in kitchens that smelled like cumin. Somewhere, a clerk stamped a date on a form that turned someone's life from pending to processed. Okay, Daniel said. Start the list. Clara opened a fresh page in a yellow legal pad, the lines bright enough to suggest order. At the top, she wrote in small, neat letters, the letter E. Then, as if speaking a spell aloud, she wrote, 1. County Clerk of Alameda. 2. Joint account closure. 3. HR documentation. 4. Lawyer consult. 5. Tell mom. She looked up. We can add 6. Forgive ourselves later. Later, Daniel said, but let's leave room. She left 3 lines blank. The bell rang again, punctual and unfeeling. Clara stood, took a practiced breath, and became the person who steadies other people's storms. Daniel stood too, the person who captures messy sound and tries to make it beautiful without lying. They opened the blinds. The ladders of light collapsed into ordinary day. On the way out, he took the bouquet. It looked better in his hand than on the table, less ceremonial, more alive. In the hallway, a student bumped into him and murmured, "Sorry, sir." Daniel smiled and said, "You're good," and could not decide if he believed the plural. The first paper cut came from a manila envelope. Daniel didn't even notice it until the drop of blood bloomed on the corner of the lease copy. It was such a small injury, a domestic, almost comic thing, but it pulsed with a quiet metaphor that made him dizzy. He wiped it with a tissue, watching the red smear stretch over the words, Tenant, Clara Hale, and L. Truncated by the fold. Even the paper, it seemed, refused to spell the full name. He had spent the evening at their kitchen table, an IKEA hybrid too modest for their rent, surrounded by piles of scanned documents and browser tabs that multiplied like guilt. Clara had gone to bed an hour earlier after grading essays about emotional intelligence, a subject she suddenly found bitterly ironic. She had kissed his shoulder, said, "Don't stay up too late," and disappeared down the hallway of their narrow apartment. Daniel stayed because the silence of paperwork was addictive. Clicking through county records gave the illusion of control, of movement. Somewhere between 2016 and 2018, the digital trail of Clara and Elijah splintered into bureaucratic oblivion, overlapping addresses, health insurance terminations, tax returns filed separately, one unsent PDF. He could see the story of her 20s in metadata. Timestamps instead of confessions. A Gmail search for Elijah returned old forwarded receipts, music gear, flight itineraries, a half-written draft titled, "Hey, just checking." In. Unsent. He opened her Facebook, then closed it immediately. He wasn't that man, he told himself, the one who scrolls into the ruins. But curiosity was no longer curiosity. It was surveillance disguised as heartbreak. He hovered over the tab again. Outside, the city coughed through its November air. Sirens, late trains, a distant dog. Brooklyn was a machine that never powered down, and tonight its hum aligned with the pulse in his finger. Daniel found Elijah Mercer's name easily on SoundCloud. 5 followers. The last upload. A live set from a dive bar in 2020, recorded on a phone, tagged #Oakland Indie Folk Ghost Song. The cover photo was a blurry neon exit sign. He listened. The track began with static and a voice counting quietly. 1, 2, 3, before sliding into a melody built on repetition. The lyrics were skeletal. I signed your name on something once. Now everything thinks I'm still you. Daniel's chest went cold. He closed the browser, then reopened it again, like a bruise he needed to check. In the bedroom, Clara turned in her sleep, murmuring. He heard his name, or thought he did. The ceiling fan spun above her like a clock hand refusing to stop. He envied her ability to sleep through unraveling. On the counter sat the yellow legal pad from earlier, the letter E scrawled at the top. Underneath, a new addition in Clara's handwriting. 6. Call Elijah tomorrow. Together. Daniel read it twice. Together. The word felt both reassuring and ominous, like walking into a courtroom as a pair. He slipped the manila envelope into his backpack, turned off the lights, and joined her in bed. The next morning arrived in grayscale. The city outside their window was all condensation and horns. Clara brewed coffee the way she always did. Clinical precision, weighed beans, slow pour, as if ritual could cancel shame. Legal aid opens at 9, she said, handing him a mug. After that, we can call Elijah. Daniel nodded. What if he doesn't answer? He will. He's always been too polite not to. They didn't look at each other while talking. The kitchen light made their shadows overlap on the tile floor, an accidental metaphor neither dared to mention. Legal aid's office was a repurposed brownstone with peeling paint and a waiting room that smelled of paper and disinfectant. A volunteer named Maggie, gray hair, kind eyes, exhaustion disguised as efficiency, handed them forms like communion wafers. Marriage dissolution due to clerical error? She said, scanning the checkbox Clara had marked. You'd be surprised how many of these we get. Systems are stubborn, especially across states. You'll need certified copies, signatures, maybe a notarized statement from the previous spouse. The phrase previous spouse hung in the air, sour and metallic. Daniel asked, How long does it take? Maggie smiled, the kind of smile built from too much realism. Anywhere from 6 to weeks to forever. They signed, initialed, and left with a folder thicker than when they'd arrived. Outside, rain misted like static. Clara tucked the papers under her coat. I can't believe I'm doing this twice, she said, almost laughing. You mean the wedding or the divorce? Daniel said. Both, maybe. He wanted to smile, but the humor lodged in his throat. That afternoon back home, they called Elijah. The phone rang 5 times before a voice answered, warm and tentative. Hey, Clara? Hi, Elijah, she said. Daniel's here too. A pause. Oh, okay. Daniel could hear a bar's soundtrack behind him, clinking glasses, the murmur of mid-shift chatter. I got your email, Clara said. We're moving forward with the paperwork. We'll need your signature again, and a declaration for the county. Right, Elijah said. I figured. It's been long overdue. His tone was calm, maybe relieved. I'm sorry, Clara. I should have pushed it years ago. Daniel leaned forward. Did you try to file before? Elijah hesitated. Yeah, back in 2018. The clerk said they needed both parties' signatures. I sent the form to your old address, the one near Lake Merritt. It got returned. Clara exhaled softly. I moved a month after that. I didn't even check the forwarding for weeks. So it just sat there? Daniel said. Guess so, Elijah answered. The world was ending that year anyway. Fires, bills, gigs canceled. I thought that maybe the marriage was like a song no one remembered the lyrics to. Something about the way he said it, the poetry of a man still romantic about his own mistakes, scraped Daniel raw. And now? He asked. Now I just want it done, Elijah said. You both deserve clean air. The line crackled. Someone called Elijah's name in the background. Mercer, 2 loggers. And he said, I'll email the form tonight. I'm glad you found each other, Clara. Really. Clara's voice gentled. Take care of yourself, okay? You too, Elijah said, then hung up. For a moment, only the refrigerator hummed between them. Clara closed her eyes. That was kinder than I deserved. Daniel didn't answer. He was watching the phone screen, Elijah's number still glowing, as if a portal had briefly opened and then sealed. That night, Daniel went for a walk through Bushwick. Rain had thinned into mist, and puddles reflected neon signs like hallucinations. Every bar he passed looked like the one in Elijah's background noise. He imagined stepping in, seeing the man from the photo, older, tired, wiping a glass with a rag. Would he recognize the husband of his accidental wife? Would they speak or just nod, 2 survivors of the same error? He kept walking. At a corner bodega, he bought a small pack of adhesive bandages. His finger had reopened, bleeding again through the thin scab. Paper cuts, he thought, always reopen when you handle the same documents. Back home, Clara was on the couch, laptop balanced on her knees, watching a counseling seminar video. Her glasses fogged at the edges. She looked up when he entered. "Walk help?" she asked. "A little," he said. He sat beside her, their shoulders touching. The screen flickered with a PowerPoint slide titled Healing Through Transparency. He let out a dry laugh. "Even your webinars are judging us." Clara smiled faintly, eyes tired but open. "Then let's pass the test." They sat in silence, the kind that wasn't peace yet, but might become it. The air smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. Outside, someone's music thumped through the wall. A bass line, steady, unchanging. Daniel took the yellow pad from the table, crossed off items 1 and 2, and added a new one. 7. Don't bleed on the paperwork. Clara laughed softly, then reached for his hand. Deal. And for the first time in days, he felt something almost like breath return. Fragile, imperfect, but real. On Friday night, Bushwick looked like a memory someone had graded for atmosphere. Warehouse doors lifted like eyelids, a tangle of bikes locked to a street sign that leaned from accumulated hope, murals lit by cheap LEDs, and the constant hiss of a city that preferred muttering to sleep. Daniel followed the small crowd down a hallway painted black, the concrete floor tattooed with decades of gum and beer. A handwritten sign on cardboard read, "Tonight, Mercer, openers at 8. The arrow pointed into a rectangular room where sound checks were small storms. He hadn't told Clara he was coming, not out of secrecy so much as the need for solitude around the next truth. She was at home, drafting emails to Alameda County, a kettle clicking off, the yellow legal pad growing a new branch of tasks. He'd kissed her temple and said, "I need to clear my head." And the look she gave him, permission braided with worry, followed him all the way to Wyckoff Avenue. The venue smelled like bodies, dust, and citrus cleaner, and the bar at the back was doing a brisk business in seltzers masquerading as cocktails. On stage, a sound tech in a hoodie moved mics with the solemnity of a priest. The lights were mostly fairy strings, and the occasional strobe set to "Merciful." Daniel took a place halfway back, beside a pillar that had seen better chalk. The opener had a voice like paper tearing. Daniel listened because listening was his reflex, pulling apart the mix in his head. Too much low end? a snare that needed a little compression, vocals that could use a small nudge at 3K. He wasn't here for them, but training was a lake you never walked out of completely dry. When Elijah took the stage, it happened without fanfare, as if he had wandered up from the audience and borrowed the guitar for a moment. He was older than the mural photo, of course, edges softened by nights, the kind of handsome that survived service industry lighting, quick smile, a posture that negotiated with gravity rather than defied it. His hair was a little longer. His chipped tooth had been half fixed, a compromise that doubled as an aesthetic. He looked like a person who apologized often and meant it most of the time. "Hey," Elijah said into the mic, voice amplified into a friendly confession. "I'm Mercer. Thanks for being here, and not in your bed, which is probably more comfortable." The small audience laughed the laugh of people who had chosen discomfort on purpose. Daniel felt something unclench, the relief of a person not trying too hard, or hiding the effort when he did. The first song began with a soft loop of a subway recording, breaks singing their industrial hymn, layered under finger-picked chords. Elijah's voice came in like a postcard written without adjectives. He sang about late shifts and dawn cigarettes, about a letter that came back, returned to sender, and sat on his dresser like an unpaid debt. It wasn't brilliant, not exactly, but it was honest in the way unambitious truths sometimes are. Daniel recognized the lyric from the SoundCloud track. "I signed your name on something once. Now everything thinks I'm still you." In the room, the line had more oxygen, less self-pity. It was a man making fun of his own superstition. Between songs, Elijah tuned quietly and told small stories that rode the line between charming and melancholy. A gig in Portland, where the only audience was a couple arguing by the pinball machine. A nurse with a shark tattoo, who gave him a cough drop at 3 a.m. in a waiting room and told him to get married for the plan. "I took that advice too literally," he said, and the room laughed, because they heard the shape of a joke and didn't know the geography of its coastline. Daniel felt the laugh like a snow flurry inside his chest, cold and scattered. During the third song, a tall woman in a denim jacket slid in beside Daniel, the kind of stranger who tells herself she's here for the music, but also checks the room for familiar ghosts. "He's better sober," she said to no one, then realized she had spoken out loud and blushed. "Sorry." "Is he sober?" Daniel asked, surprising himself. 2 years, she said. "He tells the story on stage sometimes. It's better when he doesn't." She sipped something that looked like seltzer and lime. "You know him?" "In a way," Daniel said. "I'm Daniel." "Adria," she said. "We used to play in the same Wednesday night disasters." She nodded toward the stage. "He's less of a disaster now." On stage, Elijah launched into a cover, something by the National made skinnier by one man and a guitar. People swayed, phones stayed in pockets, and the room became briefly a church for the unbelieving. Daniel's habit of listening took over, how Elijah's right hand had learned restraint, how his left found clean shapes even when nerves made them slippery. He could see the boy Clara described, and also the man, and also the long gray hallway between the two. He thought he'd feel rage, the kind that asks to be righteous and is almost always self-portraiture. But the emotion that rose was more bewildering, an ache for a country neither of them had, the one where 20-somethings don't bankrupt themselves to breathe, where love isn't so often mislabeled as logistics. The enemy wasn't the man tuning his guitar between songs. It was the ledger that had forced him to call intimacy a plan. Elijah's last song was new, or at least unrecorded. "This one doesn't have a proper ending," he said. "We're auditioning endings tonight." The lyric moved like a slow train through fog. "There's a name that lives in my pocket, and a name that hangs on the wall." I am faithful to the weather. Some bees, some so I forget to make the call. The chorus was a single line repeated until it became incantation. We meant to fix it. People hummed along by the second pass, a spontaneous choir of neglected errands. After the set, Elijah stepped off the stage and became a person in the room again, receiving the small compliments that pass for currency. Good set, man. That new one got me. You sounded tight. He nodded, thanked, laughed. He kept his hands busy, wrapping a cable, coiling and recoiling like thinking on repeat. Daniel didn't plan the approach. His feet made the decision, and the rest of him signed the form after. In the soft chaos by the stage, he said, "Elijah?" And the man looked up with professional friendliness that flickered into surprise as recognition clicked into place. "Daniel," Elijah said, and now the friendliness was stripped, leaving something raw but not hostile. "You came." "I wanted to see," Daniel said. He waited for a word like you or for myself, but none arrived dressed well enough. Elijah glanced at the cable in his hands as if it might advise him. "Do you want a drink? I can get you one." "Seltzer's fine," Daniel said. At the bar, they stood shoulder to shoulder, like uneasy cousins at a family reunion no one remembered scheduling. The bartender slid 2 seltzers across as if neither contained history. "I'm sorry," Elijah said, before the polite weather of a new conversation could form. "For the mess, for my part of it. I tried to fix it and then didn't, and that's not a moral alibi." Daniel nodded. "I know, she told me." He took a sip. The seltzer bit his tongue and said nothing useful. "I heard the phone call," Elijah said, eyes on the bar. "You sounded decent." "I'm trying to be," Daniel said. "It's a work in progress, like your song." Elijah smiled at that, a quick flash that made him briefly the boy in the mural. "I'm glad she has you, he said, and the line should have sounded like capitulation or manipulation. It didn't. It sounded like relief. A voice called from the stage for loadout, and Elijah jerked a thumb in apology. "I have to—" "Go," Daniel said. "I just wanted to see you as a person and not a file." "Likewise," Elijah said. And then, after a beat, "You're not the villain in the version I tell myself. I'm working on that too." Back on the sidewalk, the night had thinned. Air tasted like rain that wasn't sure it would commit. Daniel walked without choosing a direction, passing a storefront with a sign that read, "We repair anything," and a closed metal gate that suggested this was a promise made bravely in daylight. He thought of the list on the yellow pad, linear and defiant, and how lists forgot that healing was often recursive. By the time he reached the subway, his phone had 2 texts from Clara. "You okay? I found the notarization requirements. They make it sound like we're adopting a planet." He wrote back, "I'm okay. I heard him play. We're not fighting a person, Clara. We're fighting a decade." Dots appeared, disappeared, then reappeared. "Come home," she wrote. He typed, "On my way." In the train's fluorescent light, Daniel looked at his reflection in the window. Doubled over the tunnel's dark, ghosted by other commuters who stared into their own screens like small suns. He saw for a second the weird grace of the entire situation, a messy love triangulated by survival, the way kindness can be a kind of paperwork too, filed daily, signatures scrawled by patience. When he reached their apartment, Clara had left the hallway light on. The kettle clicked again. The water's soft roar like a cheap soundtrack to a domestic scene that held. They met in the kitchen with the exactness of people who had practiced the choreography of ordinary resilience. "How was he?" she asked. "Good," Daniel said. "Better sober, someone told me." He hesitated. "He's not the villain." Clara nodded, eyes doing the math that arrives with mercy. "Neither are we." They stood with that for a moment, 2 citizens of a fragile country called present. On the table, the yellow pad waited, patient as a clerk. Daniel added a new line under the list, without a number. Remember, we're not enemies. Clara read it, then underlined it once, as if to keep it from slipping off the page. Outside, a siren wailed, then dopplered into somewhere else. In their small kitchen, the kettle settled, the steam thinning, the walls holding. Daniel took a breath that didn't feel borrowed. He looked at Clara, tired, complicated, loved, and thought, not of paperwork or of rival men, but of the fragile bravery of staying. "Tea?" she asked. "Please, he said, and it sounded like yes to more than one thing. The following Monday began with the sound of rain crawling across glass. Not a downpour, but a patient, relentless tapping that felt more like insistence than weather. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, laptop open, a waveform frozen mid-edit. The laughter of strangers from a wedding video stared at him, pixelated and oblivious. Clara moved quietly behind him, her presence domestic and clinical at once, hair pinned up, blazer on, phone in hand. The morning light turned everything grayish gold, the color of in-between. "HR wants a meeting this afternoon," she said, stirring her coffee. "Compliance audit. They said it's procedural, but we both know what that means." He looked up. "They found out?" "They found out enough," she said. "Marital documentation, benefits cross-checks. I can't blame them. It's the system's job to distrust." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, where tension had begun to live permanently. "Do you want me there?" Clara hesitated. "They'll just see it as a liability if you come. Let me handle it. Afterward, we'll meet Elijah. 3 o'clock, Cafe Dovetail, neutral ground." "Neutral?" he repeated, tasting the irony. "Does that exist anymore?" She smiled thinly. "We can try to rent it by the hour." The Hawthorne School's HR office looked even more antiseptic than Daniel remembered. Frosted glass, motivational posters about transparency. The scent of coffee burned past sincerity. Clara sat across from 2 administrators. One young and soft-voiced, one middle-aged with the demeanor of a tax form. She held her hands in her lap, thumbs pressed together like punctuation. "Ms. Hale," the older one began, "we appreciate your openness regarding the clerical issue in your file. However, our insurance provider requires confirmation of legal marital status for dependent coverage." "Yes," Clara said calmly. "I'm in the process of correcting that. The prior marriage was an oversight. It's being dissolved." The younger administrator nodded, empathetic but rehearsed. "We understand. Unfortunately, until that's finalized, we'll need to suspend spousal benefits." Clara inhaled slowly. "Understood. And," the older continued, "given the nature of your role, student counseling, we'll need written assurance this won't interfere with professional obligations." She wanted to laugh at the idea of compartmentalization as an institutional virtue. Instead, she nodded again, the movement mechanical but polite. "It won't." Afterward, she walked through the school's corridor, passing students whose worries were simpler and crueler. College admissions, group chats, acne. Her reflection in the glass looked like a composite of her past lives. Grad student, counselor, wife, almost divorcee, all of them waiting for clearance. When she reached the street, Daniel was waiting under a shared umbrella, coffee in hand. He'd been watching the door the way some people watch for trains that might never arrive. "Well," he asked, "they're freezing my benefits until the paperwork clears." "You okay?" "I'm not sure that word applies anymore." Cafe Dovetail was the kind of Brooklyn place where plants outnumbered chairs, and every table had its own small moral lesson in the form of a quote card. Kindness is radical. Growth requires roots. Pay attention. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and introspection. Rain clung to the window panes like forgotten fingerprints. Elijah was already there, early, of course, seated by the window with a paperback open, unread. He wore a plain gray hoodie, hands around a chipped mug. He looked smaller off stage, like the volume of his own history had been turned down. When he saw them, he stood immediately. Clara, Daniel. He said their names like two verses from the same unfinished song. They sat. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The sound of the espresso machine filled the silence with its anxious rhythm. Clara broke first. "Thank you for meeting us." "Of course," Elijah said. "You deserve clarity. We all do." Daniel noted how easily the man used "we," as if the grammar of inclusion were muscle memory. Clara pulled a folder from her bag, papers labeled, highlighted, cornered with small notes in her neat handwriting. "Here's the joint account closure form and the preliminary divorce filing from Alameda County. They need your signature, notarized." Elijah flipped through the pages, his fingers steady. "I can do that today. There's a notary at the UPS store around the corner." "Thank you," she said. They paused. Rain ticked on the window. The city went about its loud business elsewhere. Daniel studied Elijah's face, tired but kind, maybe kinder than his own reflection some mornings. Elijah exhaled. "I don't know if this helps, but I want to apologize properly. Not just for the paperwork, but for the inertia. I was too broke and too stubborn to admit that doing nothing was a choice. I thought I was being harmless, and I wasn't." Clara looked at him, eyes steady. "You were also young and surviving. I made the same choice, just quieter." Elijah smiled without humor. "We were all trying to game a system that never wanted us to win." Daniel felt something shift inside him, a small untying of the rope he'd kept wound around his anger. "You both did what you had to," he said. "But the cleanup doesn't care about intentions." Elijah nodded. "You're right. Intentions don't sign documents." The notary scene, when it came, felt almost holy in its ordinariness. The three of them stood under fluorescent light, surrounded by cardboard boxes and shipping tape. Elijah signed, initialed, dated. The clerk stamped each page with a mechanical thunk that sounded like closure pretending to be music. When it was done, they stepped back into the rain. It had softened into drizzle, New York's version of forgiveness. Clara looked at Elijah. "Will you keep playing?" "Yeah," he said. "It's what I have left that doesn't expire." "Good," she said. "I like the new song." He looked startled, then grateful. "You listened?" "Daniel did," she said. "He told me." Elijah turned to Daniel, offering a small nod that carried something like peace. "Take care of her," he said, "and yourself." Daniel wanted to reply with something noble, but the best he could manage was, "You too." They watched him disappear into the gray. The streetlight caught him for a second, then let him go. That evening, Clara and Daniel returned home with wet shoes and silence that didn't sting. The legal pad sat on the table, waiting. She crossed off items 3, 4, and 5 with neat, deliberate strokes. "Almost done," she said. "Almost," Daniel echoed. He poured 2 glasses of wine, their first in days, and sat opposite her. "You handled that better than anyone should have to." "I had practice," she said softly. "Counseling other people's crises gives you terrible rehearsal for your own." He smiled, the first real one in a week. "You're still standing." She looked at him across the table. "So are you." They clinked glasses, a small, unceremonious toast to bureaucracy and endurance. Later, in bed, rain whispered against the fire escape like static, and Clara murmured into the dark, "Do you ever think about how much paperwork it takes to prove you loved someone the wrong way?" Daniel turned toward her. "Maybe that's what love is here. A long form no one fills out right the first time." She smiled into the pillow, half asleep. "Then we'll resubmit." In the morning, the rain was gone. The world smelled like metal, and new beginnings pretending to be routine. On the counter, The yellow pad waited for one final line. Daniel wrote it in pen this time. 8. Learn to live without proof. He looked at Clara, still asleep, her face calm in the weak sunlight. And for the first time, the word married felt less like a status and more like a verb. Something you kept doing, paperwork or not. The courthouse requested a story. Not in those words exactly. The email from Alameda County used phrases like sworn declaration, dates known to the best of your recollection, and attach corroborating exhibits. But a declaration was still a narrative, dressed in legal grammar. Who you were, what you did, why you stopped, and under penalty of perjury, please make it make sense. On Tuesday evening, the apartment turned into a small law office without the carpet. Clara sat at the table with her laptop, cursor blinking in a Google Doc titled Declaration of Clara Hale. Daniel arranged supporting documents in tidy stacks, notarized signatures, account statements showing a $37 balance, screenshots of returned mail notifications, a scan of the marriage certificate that looked like a sepia rumor. The yellow legal pad lay open as if auditing them. Outside, February's last cold spell rehearsed against the fire escape. Inside, the radiator made its old percussive argument with the wall. "Start with the facts," Daniel said, pouring tea into mugs that had seen too much symbolism lately. "Dates, addresses, the humane parts can come after." Clara nodded. "The humane parts are why I'm stalled." "Then we'll call them exhibits," he said gently. "Exhibit C, winter and the price of breathing." She smiled despite herself and began typing. The first sentence was bloodless on purpose. "I, Clara Hale, declare as follows." She listed dates that had become landmarks. Not because anything romantic happened there, but because leases and insurance cards had stamped them into memory. She wrote about the cough, the ER, the nurse with the shark tattoo, who had spoken bureaucratic truth into two frightened people. She wrote about splitting rent, about the summer she left for San Diego, about how distance rearranges love into pictures you can't hear. She wrote that the marriage ended not with a fight, but with a failure to return to the same weather. She typed the words in good faith and then stared at them as if they might confess further. Across from her, Daniel opened a new tab, Public Record Search, and let it sit there, unclicked. He could feel the tug of it like gravity, the promise that another database might produce a cleaner explanation. He closed the tab. He had chosen for tonight not to conduct an autopsy when the patient was still breathing. "Can I add something?" Clara asked, eyes on the screen. "Something about why people do this? The social worker in me wants to file a friend of the court brief with the universe." "Say what you need," Daniel said. "We'll translate it into clerk." Clara typed slowly. At the time, marrying for benefits felt less like deceit than community safety. Two people refusing to drown alone. "I acknowledge the harm caused by failing to timely dissolve the marriage. I accept responsibility for the delay and ask the court to allow us to correct what poverty taught us to improvise." She sat back. "Is that ridiculous?" "It's true," Daniel said, "and we can let your truth walk beside the facts." They worked and practiced quiet. Clara reconstructed addresses from old photos with Christmas lights in the background. Daniel printed the SoundCloud page as proof of Elijah's current address. Profile bio, Brooklyn, NY. Sober. Music plus bar shifts. He wondered if the line sober could be Exhibit D, character reference. The phone buzzed with a family group chat. Clara's mother had texted an article about marriage in the digital age with a caption that tried too hard to be neutral. Under it, an aunt responded with prayer hands emojis and a sunflower. Clara stared at the screen, then put the phone face down. "Do you want me to tell them?" Daniel asked. "Not yet," Clara said. "I don't want to crowdsource absolution." They paused only to eat standing up, microwaved leftovers from the bodega with the good grapes. The microwave's carousel stuttered on a dry spot and resumed, a tiny metaphor for perseverance that no one requested. At 9, the lawyer called, not a partner, but a legal aid staff attorney named Rivera, whose voice carried the low, clipped cadence of someone who spends her days organizing chaos into filings. The Zoom window bloomed on Clara's screen. Ms. Rivera in a headset, a bookshelf behind her arranged with color-coded binders, and a single plant that tried hard under fluorescent light. "Good evening," Rivera said. "I've reviewed your packet. We'll file an application for a summary dissolution based on separation date exceeding the statutory period and no shared property beyond the closed account. The judge will want clean timelines and clean signatures. Feelings are not admissible. Clarity is." Clara nodded. "Understood." Daniel leaned into frame. "There was a previous attempt to file in 2018 that stalled for lack of a signature. We have a returned mail notice." "Excellent," Rivera said. "That mitigates intent. It shows effort, even failed." "Does it mitigate harm?" Daniel asked, surprising himself. Rivera gave a small, human smile. "Courts mitigate paperwork. Harm is for poets and therapists. But clean paperwork helps people breathe." After the call, the apartment exhaled. Clara scrolled to the bottom of her declaration and typed, "Executed on," with today's date. A punctuation mark disguised as a line. She printed it and signed in blue ink that looked too earnest for law. Daniel watched her write her name with a steadiness he hadn't seen all week. "Your turn," she said, sliding a second document across. "Declaration of Daniel Brooks. They want an affidavit from the current spouse. Present tense. Confirms knowledge and non-contestation." He read the template language. "My understanding, to the best of my knowledge, I do not oppose." And something in his chest felt like the click of a seatbelt. He picked up the pen. He wrote carefully. "I am Daniel Brooks, lawful spouse of Clara Hale under New York law. I support and do not contest the dissolution of her prior marriage to Elijah Mercer. I understand the facts as described and ask the court to expedite relief. I further state that this process has been conducted in good faith and with the intention to align our legal status with our lived truth." He hesitated, then added a line he knew a clerk would ignore, but he needed the universe to read. "I am choosing the present, even where the past keeps good records." He signed. The pen made a small dry sound on the paper, like a cricket in winter. Afterward, Clara went to the bedroom and returned with a shoebox, set it on the table, and lifted the lid like she was opening a window. Inside, a stack of journals, moleskins with corners softened by years. She touched the top one. "Would you read?" she asked. "I'm not proud of all of it, but if we're filing declarations, you should have the unfiled kind too." He took the one stamped 2016-2017. The pages smelled faintly of dust and coffee. The handwriting was hers, tight, deliberate, slightly slanted, as if moving forward required a lean. He read entries written in the margins of long days, notes about clients at the practicum, pseudonyms, always, grocery lists, diagrammed feelings, sketched in a corner, a Corolla with a coat hanger for an antenna, a sentence that made him stop. "Love is easier when it's not being asked to be a landlord." He turned the page. "We married at City Hall. It felt like building a raft from invoices. I felt both saved and small." Another. "We laughed at tacos. I wanted to be grateful without being indebted to fate." He closed the journal and set his hand over the cover. "Thank you," he said. "Two words that had to carry 'I see you,' and I don't flinch, and we can stay." Clara watched him, her face unarranged, waiting for the verdict that would not be called that. Not in this house. "Does it make it worse?" she asked quietly. "Knowing the texture of it?" No, Daniel said. It makes it three-dimensional. Paper had flattened it. This gives it air. He paused. He tried to file, and the mail failed him. You tried to move on, and the world punished imprecision. We all did the bureaucratic math wrong. That's not the same as betrayal. It's negligence in the first degree of being human. She laughed, startled. Is that a chargeable offense? Only in New York, he said, the joke landing soft. Near midnight, they assembled the packet like a ritual. Declarations, exhibits, notarizations, cover page with case number. Daniel labeled a USB drive filed, not filed like a punchline for accountants. He wanted to send it now, to outrun doubt. But Rivera had said, morning is better. Judges read first thing while coffee still believes in justice. Before bed, Clara stepped out onto the fire escape. The metal cold through her socks. The city offering its nocturnal syllabus. Sirens, a couple arguing 3 floors down about a dog, the low moan of a garbage truck practicing for apocalypse. She breathed the air that smelled like pennies and possibility. Behind her, Daniel leaned on the window frame. Tomorrow, we send it, he said. And then we wait, she said. And while we wait, he said, we live. She turned. Through the glass, their kitchen looked like any kitchen. The yellow pad lay on the table. He wrote a new line as she watched. 9. Tell the truth even when the form doesn't require it. She nodded. Add another, she said softly. He did. 10. Believe the other person. They turned out the lights. In the bedroom, their phones charged like understudies' learning lines. The shoebox of journals rested under the bed, not hidden so much as housed. Somewhere far away, a clerk's inbox slept, empty and possible. Morning would insist on itself, but tonight, the declarations existed, both kinds, on paper and in the air, co-signed by 2 tired people who had decided that the most radical filing was to keep choosing each other in a country made of forms. The morning came in fragments. Light fractured through the blinds. The smell of burnt toast. The sound of Clara's phone buzzing like a nervous animal on the counter. For a moment, Daniel thought it was just another weekday. Then he remembered. Today, they mailed the dissolution packet. Today, the past would finally have an address to go to. Clara was at the table, hair damp, glasses fogged from steam rising out of her mug. She was reading the declaration one last time before sending it, lips moving silently as if each word needed rehearsal. On the table, the manila envelope lay open, edges perfectly squared. Coffee? She asked without looking up. He nodded, pouring himself some. The bitterness felt honest. You sure you don't want to file it electronically? Clara smiled faintly. After everything, I trust the post office more than the cloud. He half smiled. You're an analog romantic. And you're a man who tracks sound waves for a living. We both believe invisible things can be measured. He took a seat beside her. For the first time, he didn't feel like a spectator to her crisis. He felt like a co-author of whatever this next draft of life would be. When she sealed the envelope, the sound was both small and ceremonial. The adhesive gave way with a quiet sigh, and the past became paperwork. Clara wrote the address carefully, every letter a tiny act of penance. I'll drop it off on my way to work, she said. Want me to come? She shook her head. You already came far enough. By evening, the envelope was gone, mailed from a post office where the clerk had the patience of a saint and the eyes of someone who'd seen people ship both love and regret in similar packaging. When Clara came home, she found Daniel cooking. A modest miracle. The apartment smelled like garlic and rosemary, small triumphs simmering in olive oil. A bottle of wine waited on the counter, unopened. You didn't have to, she said softly. I did, he said, because you mailed it, because we're still here. Dinner was quiet in the way peace can be quiet. Not absence of sound, but absence of defense. They talked about work, about a client of his who'd canceled a project because the bride didn't like the sound of her own vows. Clara laughed, really laughed, the sound startling them both. Later, after dishes, Daniel found himself standing by the window, watching the city shimmer like a circuit board. Clara joined him, a wine glass in her hand, her hair smelling faintly of rain. "Do you ever think about the people we used to be?" she asked. "All the time, Mossem," he said. "But lately, I try to forgive them instead of audit them." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I think about the girl in that courthouse, signing papers for health insurance. She wasn't selfish. She was scared. But she thought that made her clever. And the boy she married thought survival was the same thing as commitment," Daniel said. "And the man she later married?" she asked, looking up. He smiled, slow and tired. "He's still learning the difference between jealousy and grief." They stayed there for a while, their reflections overlapping on the glass. Two ghosts that had decided not to haunt each other anymore. That weekend, they took a small trip upstate, something they'd postponed since before everything unraveled. A cabin by the Hudson, all reclaimed wood and minimalist promises. No Wi-Fi, just a kettle, a stack of books, and the kind of quiet that makes you remember your own pulse. On the drive, Daniel made a playlist, old indie tracks Clara used to love, plus a few of Elijah's songs, the ones Daniel couldn't unhear. Clara noticed but didn't comment. When We Meant to Fix It came on, she reached over, turned the volume down halfway, and said, "He's better sober." Daniel smiled. "You told me that." At the cabin, they cooked together, chopped vegetables in rhythm, found a way to inhabit the same small kitchen without apology. After dinner, they sat outside on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, the sound of crickets like static between radio stations. "I used to think forgiveness meant forgetting," Clara said. "Now I think it's remembering differently." He nodded. "Maybe forgiveness is just editing the story so it stops hurting in the same places." She looked at him, her face lit by the porch light, eyes steady. "You still love me?" "Yes," he said. "But it's a different kind of yes. It's not a song anymore. It's more like a note that keeps holding even after the melody changes." Clara's eyes softened. "I can live with that." They kissed then. Not the cinematic kind, not redemption. Just two people closing a small distance that bureaucracy had tried to name. The following week, a letter arrived. Daniel found it in the mailbox, the county seal printed in tired blue ink. He brought it upstairs, held it like something fragile. Clara was in her office, typing a counseling report. "It's here," he said. She froze. "Already?" He nodded. They opened it together. Inside was a single page, dry and factual. Judgment of dissolution granted. Effective immediately. Clara read it twice. Then she exhaled, a sound that broke and healed in the same breath. "It's done," she whispered. Daniel watched her face. Relief, sorrow, exhaustion, all occupying the same space. He reached for her hand. "So what now?" She smiled faintly. "Now we live in the present tense." That night she pulled an old shoebox from under the bed, the one that once held journals. Inside she'd added a few new pages, a printout of the dissolution, a copy of Daniel's affidavit, and one of Elijah's songs on a burned CD labeled Proof of Life. "Keeping it?" Daniel asked. "It's part of the archive," she said. "Someday when I talk to my students about choices, I want to show them what survival actually looks like." He nodded. "You'll make a good lesson plan." She laughed softly, slid the box back under the bed, and turned off the light. In the dark, Daniel said quietly, "You know what's strange? I don't feel like we fixed something. I feel like we made peace with how broken it was." "That's fixing," she murmured. just not the kind they write songs about. He thought of Elijah's stage, the dim lights, the refrain, "We meant to fix it," and realized maybe they all had in their own unfinished grammar. Weeks later, spring arrived with its arrogant brightness. Trees budded like they'd never heard of bureaucracy. Clara's HR reinstated her benefits. Daniel booked a new client, a short film about grief that he didn't have to research to understand. One night, after work, they met at a small bar in the East Village, a place with live jazz, no name on the door. A man with a trumpet played a tune Daniel couldn't identify, something half hopeful, half haunted. Clara leaned close. "This city never stops rehearsing heartbreak, does it?" "No," he said, smiling. "But sometimes the soundtrack's good." She clinked her glass against his. "To us." "To the present," he said. They drank. The trumpet bent a note that hung in the air, imperfect but true. For a moment, Daniel thought of every version of themselves, young, scared, married to survival, and felt gratitude for all of them. Love, he thought, wasn't the opposite of error. It was the art of staying after the correction. The morning they moved, sunlight hit the apartment like forgiveness. Boxes lined the hallway, neat, labeled, almost smug in their orderliness. Clara stood by the window, hair loose, sleeves rolled up, looking out at the city that had been both their battlefield and their shelter. Daniel was crouched by the stereo, coiling cables, one hand lingering on the mixer as if saying goodbye to the sound of their life here. "You'd think leaving a one-bedroom wouldn't take 3 days, Padda," he said. Clara smiled. "It's not the square footage that's hard to pack." He looked up. "You ready?" She nodded, and then quieter. "Almost." The new place wasn't far, just 6 subway stops north, on a quieter street where laundromats still wrote their signs by hand. A walk-up with a cracked stoop and neighbors who smiled through exhaustion. The apartment was smaller, but the light was better. Their first afternoon there, they opened all the windows and let the noise of the city flood in. Clara unpacked books first, stacking them on the floor like temporary walls. Daniel unrolled a rug that didn't quite fit but pretended to. They argued about where the couch should go, then laughed because the argument was too gentle to count. At sunset, they ordered Thai food and ate cross-legged on the floor. The cardboard containers left dark rings on the new wood. Clara stared at them and said, "I want to remember this mess. It's proof we, joy, lived." Daniel grinned. "We're very poetic when we're tired." She nudged him with her knee. "Maybe that's the only time poetry's honest." That night, when the city settled into its low electric hum, Daniel couldn't sleep. The move had left his body buzzing with unfinished energy. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Clara, and walked to the kitchen, where the last unopened box waited on the counter. The box was marked in her handwriting, "Archive." Inside were fragments of their story, old receipts, photos, letters, the journals she'd once shared, and on top the final copy of the dissolution judgment. He picked it up, tracing the embossed seal with his thumb. It felt both too heavy and too light. In the quiet, he found his reflection in the dark window, a man holding proof of someone else's freedom and maybe his own. Clara's voice startled him softly from behind. "Can't sleep?" He turned. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in the blanket, eyes half closed. "Too quiet," he said. She walked to him, leaned against the counter. "When I was little," she murmured, "I used to think silence was the sound of being safe. Then I grew up and realized it's just the sound of things you haven't faced yet." He smiled faintly. "So what's this sound then?" She listened. Fridge hum, pipes creaking, a siren somewhere far away. "That," she said, "is the sound of nothing chasing us." He exhaled. "I'll take it." A week later, Clara received an email from Elijah. Subject line, "Thanks for closing the loop." She opened it while Daniel cooked. The message was brief. "Hey, Clara. I got the final copy today. It feels strange and right at the same time. I've been writing again. Something about starting over, about debt and grace. I hope you and Daniel are well. I mean that. Be good to each other." Clara read it twice, then forwarded it to Daniel without comment. When he checked his phone, he stood quietly for a long moment. "What are you thinking?" she asked from the doorway. He wiped his hands on a towel. That maybe forgiveness doesn't need to be dramatic. Sometimes it just arrives in lowercase. She smiled, relieved. We can live with lowercase. In March, they drove upstate again. Same route, same playlist, different wait. The trees were waking, the Hudson silver under the afternoon light. They stopped at a roadside diner where the waitress called everyone Han, and the coffee tasted like memory. Over pancakes, Clara said, "Do you ever feel like we're still in the middle of something, even though the paperwork says it's done?" Daniel stirred sugar into his cup. "Maybe that's what life is, a middle that never admits it's not the end." She reached across the table, tracing a small circle on his wrist. "I'm glad you stayed." "I almost didn't," he said honestly. "But then I realized leaving would just mean taking the mess somewhere else." Clara smiled. "I love you for that." He looked at her, eyes tired but soft. "Then maybe we're learning." Spring turned to the kind of summer that made the air shimmer like mirage. Their new neighborhood bloomed with open windows and music leaking from every apartment. Pop songs, jazz, a stray saxophone chasing itself. Clara began a new program at work, counseling students dealing with family instability. Daniel landed a gig scoring a short film called Elsewhere, a story about parallel lives and missed trains. On the first night of editing, he told Clara, "The director wants the music to sound like regret that learned how to breathe." She smiled. "Then you're perfect for it." He worked late into the night, building layers of sound that rose and fell like tides. Echoes, field recordings, faint piano under breath. At one point, he looked over his shoulder and saw Clara asleep on the couch. Her body curled, the faint rhythm of her breathing syncing with the soft loop he'd built. The moment felt cinematic, but also ordinary, which was better. He saved the file as track 7, The Apartment Breathes Back. By August, the heat had become biblical. One evening, they climbed to the roof with cheap wine and sat under the smeared skyline. The air smelled of tar and jasmine. Below, someone's radio played an old love song that didn't know it was ironic. Clara said, "Do you think there's a version of us that didn't go through any of this?" Daniel thought for a while. Probably. Somewhere, two people are still unhurt, but I don't think they know each other as well. She nodded. "I like our version better. It's less shiny, but it feels earned." They sat in silence, watching planes draw faint scars across the dark. Then Clara said, almost to herself, "You know, I used to think happiness was a destination. Something you arrive at once you're done surviving. But now I think it's just choosing to stay in the same place long enough to notice the light change." Daniel smiled, looking at her. "You sound like your own therapist." "I take my work home sometimes." He leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "You chose me." She turned, met his eyes. "I keep choosing you." They kissed, slow and quiet, the city exhaling around them like a witness relieved. Later that night, back inside, Clara wrote in her journal for the first time in months. She titled the page Elsewhere. There's a place inside every marriage where the other person can't follow. We call it privacy, or pride, or damage. The trick isn't breaking in, it's learning to knock. Daniel and I are still knocking. Sometimes the door opens, sometimes the silence answers. Both are forms of love. She closed the notebook, left it open enough to dry the ink. Daniel stirred in his sleep, murmuring her name. Outside, New York murmured its endless monologue, sirens, wind, the low hum of electricity pretending to be starlight. In another, Boro. Perhaps Elijah finished a song no one else would hear and felt the same quiet relief. Morning came slow and forgiving. The kitchen smelled like coffee and rain. Clara opened the window. The city yawned awake. Daniel poured 2 cups, handed her one. "To us?" he said. She shook her head, smiling. "To here." He clinked his mug against hers. "To elsewhere," he corrected. They laughed, because maybe both were the same thing now. And for the first time in a long while, the air between them felt wide open, like a letter finally delivered, like an answer that didn't need to explain itself.